Hello everyone, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today's guest for the show is Erik Davis. Erik Davis is an American writer, scholar, journalist, and public speaker whose writings have run the gamut from rock criticism to cultural analysis to creative explorations of esoteric mysticism. He is perhaps best known for his book, Technosis: Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, as well as his work on California counterculture, including Burning Man, the Human Potential Movement, and the writings of Philip K. Dick. He is also the host of the Expanding Mind podcast. Erik and I sat down at Ozora Festival back in August of 2018 for a on-location interview. This is one of, I think, four that I got while I was traveling this summer on my own European speaking tour. And like the other ones, audio obviously is not as good as it would be inside of the studio here. So, a little bit of forgiveness for that in advance, but I am very happy to bring you this interview with Erik Davis. In the interview, Erik and I talk about why he feels that objective reality is dissolving away and what the liquefaction of objective or consensus reality presents us insofar as challenges and opportunities as modern people. There's also a little bonus clip that we shot just afterwards that will be up on my YouTube channel in a couple weeks, but patrons of the show will be able to check it out right away. And it is talking with Erik on his thoughts around death and dying, in particular reference to the transhumanist movement. Speaking of Patreon, I want to give a big thank you to the patrons of Adventures Through the Mind who help keep these bright fluorescent lights on that are illuminating my face right now, as well as the heat going in my home, and the podcast continuing to run. So huge thanks to those patrons, especially the patrons whose names are listed here on your video screen on YouTube. And also a big thanks to David for the wondrous PayPal donation. If you, the listener, are appreciating the show and would like to help fund its existence and give back in a way that gives on to the growth, development, and sustainability of the podcast, you can do so by becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/JamesWJesso, by leaving a PayPal donation, which is going to be linked in the description to this episode, or you could buy a t-shirt, which are brand new, and I please do encourage you to head over to the shop at jameswjesso.com to check out the new t-shirts. Alternatively, you could purchase a recently released lecture, video lecture that I just put up on the shop as well, which is my talk about meaning, was psychedelics, ritualistic suffering, and the meaning of life, which was giving in Amsterdam this year of 2018 to the Psychedelic Society of the Netherlands. Alternatively, you could also buy my book. So basically, any money that you put directly into the show or into the products surrounding the show or my work is a beautiful contribution to supporting the show. So thank you so much. All those options are available at jameswjesso.com/support or listed in the description to this episode on YouTube or wherever else you're watching it, such as on jameswjesso.com. I think that's enough preamble. I welcome you into this interview with Erik Davis, live on location in the back room of a very busy central office called the Nautilus on the festival grounds of Ozora in Hungary. This year, 2000, I don't even remember what I already said. Recorded 28, the interview. Enjoy. Whoa, Erik Davis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's been a weird, sweaty complication to make this happen.
It's good. It's like, that's what's fun about festivals. There's all these problems that you got to solve, and if you do them in the right spirit, kind of a humorous agreement to play with chaos and just sort of deal with the weird circumstance, it's really fun.
Yeah, and even, I mean, there's one thing about just the functionality of, achieving some sort of goal set that's mixed up in that. And then there's also the internal process of being in such an environment almost decompresses a lot of stuff that we're holding down. And I know for myself, things come up. And now I'm not just trying to figure out, how to get back to my tent and stay mostly dry now that it's raining and not covered in mud. I'm thinking about like, whoa, how do I make sense of this this story where I'm not good enough and nobody wants to hang out with me and the festival's not going right, or I'm bad at festivals, like that kind of chaos as well.
Oh yeah, it's a really ripe environment. I've gone through some tremendous learning at festivals. I mean, I just remember one time I was just riding around in the afternoon on bikes at Burning Man in maybe 2002 or something, and somehow I lost my friends. And even though I wasn't even like super tripping or anything, I was probably stoned or something. And I just, I went right into that childhood abandonment, thing. And I can't say that I necessarily dealt with it very well. I had to kind of just sort of be there for a while. And then, but there's something about festival environments too, is if you're willing to kind of lean out of your state, like recognize the state, maybe you're not getting out of the state anytime soon, but then just kind of take calm, stay within it, and then still pay attention to what's going on outside of you. There's all these little hooks that'll pull you into other worlds, a beat that attracts you, or a conversation with a stranger that gets you into a different head space, or a task, like, oh, I got to do this thing. Okay, I'm just going to be very attentive about this particular mundane thing I have to do, but in doing that, I kind of bring back this sort of sense of confidence and playfulness. So there are amazing spaces for psychological self-work and, encountering the world in unexpected ways.
Yeah. What you're saying here kind of reminds me of one of the ways I look at a practice that I have called contact improvisation. Well, it's not a practice that I have, it's a practice that I participate in, a dance practice. And one of the things I look at, it's like the dance is a ritualistic container for all of life. And everything that happens within it can be a metaphor for all of life. And even in this situation, it's like, yeah, everything is chaotic and you're at a festival and it's strange stuff that you're doing, but it's not really, the only thing that makes it all that different from the otherwise mundane, arduous things that you're doing in your daily life is that here everything is so novel and there's a greater possibility for the emergence of insight and the emergence of something truly miraculous in some sense, which I wonder is even possible in our daily life if we sort of bring that energy home with us.
I think there's elements of it. I think that sometimes, for example, in your daily life, I'm trying to think of a good example. I might not pick one right out of the top of my head or whatever, but where you're in a complicated situation, or you have to like respond quickly, or the cop stops you and you're in the car, or there's something where you have to like respond quickly, that you can use skills honed in these kinds of environments, a kind of intelligent, intuitive spontaneity, where you trust what you're throwing forward, even though it's kind of a dice roll, it's a risk, but there's a way of kind of getting okay with that and being used to chaos and being used to recognize you don't know what's going to happen. The cop could be cool, or it could be that you can show up just perfectly for this guy's personality to like not hassle you. You don't know, so why not play a good hand or a creative hand?
Whatever hand you got.
Or whatever way. So sometimes it's the only thing you can come up with. You have no idea whether it's good or bad.
Just bluff your way.
Yeah, it's true. Well, it's a kind of bluff reality in some ways,
Speaking of which, one of the primary themes in your talk, and this might be a stretch, but I do speaking of which, so it seems as though the conversation has continuity, but one of the themes in your talk yesterday was this idea that consensus reality is breaking down. It was reality liquefied was the name of your talk. These are two heavy things that are being said. First, you're making a statement for there being a consensus reality. You're making a case for that, and then you're making a case for its disintegration. So maybe you can explain to us what you mean by consensus reality, although it seems quite intuitive to just pick it up, but just to be clear on the terms of reason here.
No,
and then how it's breaking down.
Yeah, that's good. No, it's important stuff. I mean, I think, if you start talking about what is reality and you just kind of leave it there, you can have an interesting conversation, but it's really hard. Like, what framework are you talking about? Are you talking physics? Are you talking phenomenology? Are you talking philosophical? Are you talking nature and science. I mean, it's really hard to do. But consensus reality is a more limited object that, as you say, I think we have a pretty good intuitive sense of. We have an individual reality that's my the history of my nervous system's reaction to the world, the patterns I've built up, my language, my symbol system, my sense of ritual, my sense of what's clean and what's dirty. All of these things I didn't come into this world with. They're part of my culture, what has shaped me, what my little brain when I was a kid was like mapping everything all the time, and like what maps are going to work. Oh, well, in this reality it works to have this idea of washing your hands or whatever it is. And so we have this whole kind of realm of collective experience that's symbolic, that's language, that's cultural ideas, cultural systems. And in our modern world, at least in the 20th century, let's just say, so the world that we are kind of coming out of, and if we're younger, we got a little taste of it, and if we're older, we had more of a taste of it, was a world of mass media, where there were relatively few media channels, and particularly around news. That's the most obvious place to see it, but it's not just that. This is the era of television or the era of mass advertising, where everybody is being advertised with the same kind of message. And this helped nations kind of cohere to a certain degree as they navigated this increasingly complex world of hyper-capitalism, of globalism.
On mass scale.
Yeah, on just across populations. Yeah. So, in the 1960s, let's say, you might totally disagree with the news, but everybody knew what Walter Cronkite was saying in the United States, who was a famous newscaster, and everybody watched his show. And so that's part of how we maintain consensus reality. It's not the only way, but media and media images and ideas are one of the main mechanisms for that. And so part of what I'm saying with the loss of consensus reality is just like a media fact. It's just a sociological point that's not, I think, that controversial, which is just that as media streams multiply, as everyone becomes a producer of information, of news, of perspectives, that there's this kind of, not so much maybe breakdown is part of it, but it's also kind of like multiplication, where there's suddenly all of these views. And if we're savvy, we become aware in a somewhat frightening way that part of what we have to do is navigate between all of these different claims about what's going on. I mean, politics is the obvious place to see that. I don't really want to go into all that stuff because I love festivals for like a little bubble out. But just to make a general comment, I mean, it's very easy in the United States to see, the Trump people, they're plugged into certain kinds of information. And then the liberals, the sort of New York intelligentsia liberal world is plugged into their sources. And you start to see the stories and the mythology and the way those things are being manipulated with their own goals. And then you're like, oh my God, where do I go? Like, how do I think? What do I believe? How do I navigate this place? And that's also kind of what I mean is a little more, not just that media is multiplying and sources of information are overwhelming our ability to keep up with a model of reality that makes sense, but it's also like a condition, like an existential condition, like, oh my God, what is reality? Suddenly this big philosophical, ontological problem is a problem that every thinking person is dealing with. And some people don't think, they accept their story, they go, I'm a Trump supporter and liberals are bad and Mexicans are evil, and I'm speaking in American terms because those are the ones I know. But in Hungary, we like the new government, they're helping control us, migrants are evil and must be exterminated or prevented from coming in. And I'm not saying that these are easy problems. The problem of migrancy is very complicated and cultures get overwhelmed. So I'm not saying like, they should be really friendly and da-da-da. I'm just saying there's a way of settling into a certain identity position, a certain worldview that can be very safe because I know, or the leader knows, and I know that I'm behind the leader. And that kind of mechanism, which kind of leads towards something like fascism, is very attractive at a point of social breakdown and of confusion because you're like safe, you're safe, you know what you're on about. And if you're not doing that, then it's a very complicated world we're in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm wondering about
let's slow down a little bit. I wanted to jump in there real quick, but I don't want to feel rushed, even though we have limited time. There's a value to being able to all know we're on the same page. There's also a severe limitation there, because possibly the page that we're on is Nazism. It's National Socialism, right? Or it's insert other example here, equivalent example here. And yet there's another danger in having no ground at all. And I'm curious where you see this, where you see the dangers are in this shifting towards a full decentralization of media and a lack of being able to trust any frameworks we were given. I mean, it's pretty easy now. It's quite common, especially in festival culture, to say, I don't trust the mainstream media. Okay, cool. So then who do you trust? And then at what point do you, and not to necessarily claim that it's true or not true, at what point do you say, well, now I only trust the people who are David Icke conspiracy-esque, or at some point it's like, I can't trust NASA, everything they've said is a lie, and now I only trust flat Earth theory, or being like, I can't trust anyone, but I feel like I understand how Donald Trump speaks, and so I trust that everything else is fake news. It's like, so where are the dangers here that you're seeing arising? I might have just fished all those.
Well, in a way, I think you answered your own question, is that it becomes very, the sort of commitment to a particular perspective is worthy of distrusting. But then there's this problem of, well, then I don't trust anything. What do I trust? How do I trust? And it's not individualistic, but I do believe there's sort of, you have to grow comfortable with the existential condition of being confused, and that we don't really have a complete model, and that we have to work within this not knowing. And then within that, two, I think, important features. One is that in a way, there's no better time to wake up. There's no better time to psychologically evolve, to integrate, whatever the words you might want to use, to individuate, and Jungians might say, because our circumstances are providing us very intense opportunities to go through our fears, our delusions, our attachments, our beliefs, our overbeliefs, the beliefs that we don't even question because they're so far behind us. And to work with those, I think is a really good way. So how do you do that? Well, one way is that you do become more and more attentive and aware of your own experience. Because whatever else may or may not be true, even if you're misreading your experience is still happening. Yeah. So as you become more attuned to that, and both accepting its messages, accepting the experiences, integrating the ones that you intuit, feel good, feel smart, feel correct, and at the same time being willing to continue this questioning process, sometimes very gently, that you sort of develop it's like ballast in a ship. You got to have ballast, or the ship gets blown around a lot, right? So you got to have a kind of weight. So almost like one of the things that meditation gives you is a capacity to sink into your own experience, hands off, just to kind of recognize what's going on and to sort of reorient around a sort of experientiality rather than a concept about what is happening. And that, I think, that's not enough, but it's something. And the other thing that I think is important, and everybody finds themselves in a different place, but is to develop friendships and connections, particularly around ideas, around talking, around processing these experiences or questions about what's going on in the world, and be aware of how your network, whether it's face-to-face, people you meet at a festival, or people you find online, although online I think it's often a lot harder because there's so much noise. Yeah. But even there, it's about finding people that you trust, who resonate with you, who are capable of calling you on your own shit. That's really important. If they are not capable of calling you on your own shit,
They're just sycophants, then it's not.
yeah, they either like just want to support you, or they're too self-deluded to see, or whatever. And we all know, and this can be in very psychological ways, it can be in philosophical ways, it can be about science, it can be about politics. There's lots of ways that people, so sort of probe your network and find people whose ideas and thoughts you trust, as well as their heart, as well as their life values, and kind of build off of them. Let them filter. Sometimes you don't know and you ask them, and they're just rolling the dice too. But they have a little bit more on their side, so that helps you kind of orient. You know, what do I think about this idea? How do I think about flat Earth, for example? And that, I think, and my hope is that sort of process raises the intelligence. And it's always good to be friends with people who are wiser than you, who are more intelligent than you, or have more knowledge about something that you're interested in. So when you're choosing friends or probing connections, level up. Always go up to something that you maybe don't know, and maybe there's something maybe even a little bit scary because maybe they know something or they're cooler than you or whatever. But working up rather than always being with people who are just very safe.
Yeah.
There's sort of a sweet spot between safe and challenge that, in my personal experience, has been an incredible boon and helps me stay sane, because I can partly navigate through that network of perspectives.
There's an interesting correlation that happened as you were speaking. As you were talking, and I'm just going to point this out, as you were talking about learning to be centered in the chaos was the loudest it could have possibly gotten in this environment. And here I am centering in the chaos for the listeners as well, centering in the chaos as you're speaking. I'm curious, and this again is another jump, and I might be fishing here a little bit. I'm hearing you speak, and I'm really hearing a cross-application of the skills that are developed when tripping psychedelics to the world that we're in now, which seems to be quite psychedelic. Whatever you could possibly think of is available to you, if only as entertainment on the internet at this point. I mean, even the weirdest, darkest, most fetish shit you can think of is available, legal or not. What do you feel is among many possible options might be the value of psychedelics in the current breakdown or fractalizing of consensus reality? And in that, what might be the danger edge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I believe that part of the reason that psychedelics are why there's a psychedelic renaissance is there's almost a kind of intuitive sense among many people, not the psychedelic community, not the hippie, neo-hippie, post-hippie, travel or whatever world, but a much broader world, that there's something in these things that not just can heal us, which is the dominant metaphor we have now. You know, we have the medical model with MDMA as something that heals people from PTSD or from, So there's a medical model in the more mainstream picture of psychedelics. And it's also true in the hippie space. Ayahuasca is a medicine. It will help you heal, it'll help you go through trauma, all that. That's very important. But I think there's another cognitive thing going on, which is that we sense there's something about what you learn cognitively as you learn how to navigate through these realms, navigate your emotions, particularly fear, to navigate your seductions, what grabs your eye, where do you go, what pulls you, why, what's behind what pulls you. And I think those two elements already are giving you something very concrete for navigating our world. On the one hand, an attention to reactivity, particularly fear-based reactivity, to be okay with not knowing, or to be okay with threat, to be okay even with some paranoia. I mean, there's reasons to be paranoid. And you may find yourself at a place where information is coming in and your own psychology is going, where suddenly it's like, whoa, like super dark. But if you've been through heavy psychedelic experience, you kind of know what super dark can be like. And sometimes you navigate it well, and sometimes it eats you alive, but you come up the next day. And so there's a certain sort of a willingness to work with the shadow that comes through more difficult psychedelic experiences. And then in a more positive way, where you're sort of navigating by resonance, like what's working, what's clicking, what's integrating, how does this open up into a larger field, or there's something that's attracting me here. Oh wait, it feels like a being. I'm in relationship with this, whatever it is, whether it's a place or a track or something somebody said or whatever, or person. You sort of develop a way of navigating by resonance, and being, again, it requires some kind of observation. You're sort of working with it. Why this? What does this do? Why am I drawn to this? And some of them might be not so healthy for you. Some of them might actually be addictive in some way, or whatever way you can think about it. But you start to be able to trust your ability to kind of find the right people or the right sources or the allies that are appropriate for you at that time. And I kind of feel like that's another way that we, even just the way we deal with information sources. How do we trust? What kinds of voices resonate with us? The dangers is everything I just said about a way to move through that world, it's not clear to me how you do not fall into, let's say, the flat earth trap or the paranoid archon lizard thing or whatever that is. And it's complicated to say that because there's different ways that people navigate those, let's say, call them conspiratorial worlds. And I've spent a lot of time in that zone, sort of trying to grok it and kind of work within it and figure out how to do it. And I have very complicated feelings about it. I'm not sure how to respond to it in a lot of ways. And I think that what I was describing can also explain how someone finds themselves resonating with this idea, intuitively distrusting this source, and finding themselves very magnetically attracted to a particular information source, a person, and where you really resonate with them and you're like, yeah, that makes sense, that works for me. And people do this all the time. We do this, sort of how religions work, it's how the New Age works, it's how crystal healing works, it's how the occult works in a lot of ways. And it's a spectrum, you know. I think in some way we have to kind of be in that imaginal world where crazy possibilities might be true. And at the same time, I have a lot of respect for science. So I think that it's really, really important to keep one foot in the sort of secular scientific reality as best you can. Not because it's true or truer, but because, again, it provides ballast. It provides sort of sources that enable you to go, So, for example, with the flat earth, like you say, a lot of it, I believe, occurred, because I was very interested in that one, because I'm pretty soft on a lot of conspiracies. Like, I'm like, okay, who knows? It's a weird world. Like, I'm pretty anarchic in my ontology. I don't know what's going on. It could be working at all sorts of levels. I'm open to that possibility. But the insistence on the flat earth as a physical reality was very much a line in the sand for me. That's where I was like, okay, this is absurd. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What does it look like from the inside? And it's complicated. There's different things to say. There's a lot of specific arguments that do draw off your own experience, your perceptual experience, that seem like, hey, why is that like that? Why is this like that? Get you into all the nitty gritty. But at the core of it, I believe, is people not trusting, the lack of trust in institutions.
Right, and that's a big thing for me. It's like, well, why should I believe that this is true in comparison to everything I've been told my entire life? And usually the answer was something along the lines of, because everything NASA says is a lie to control you.
Right.
And it's like, well, now you're expecting me to believe you because everything else is a big conspiratorial lie to make sure we don't believe the Earth is flat. Because of why? Yeah. And the Earth is the only flat planet because of why exactly? Yeah. Simply to lie to us? To what ends?
Yeah. One of I think the best thoughts to respond to that kind of thing with, maybe there's a couple ones, but one I think is helpful, is to go, okay, in your life, think about the institutions that you know best. It might be your family, it's usually a place you work, maybe it's the school, the education institution. Any place where you have some sense about how bureaucracies work, how institutions work. And if you're honest with yourself, you see that they are riven with complex conflicts, aggressive attacks, outmovers, different concentrations, different perspectives, different ways of describing what the institution is happening. They're full of conflict and perspectives. The idea that an institution that's as massive and complex as NASA, with decades and decades of history, hundreds of thousands of people, including many scientists who, whatever you want to say about the problems with science, is that many people who are drawn to science are very ethical about their idea of truth. They try really hard to be true and to distinguish between truth and false. The amount of the unlikeliness that an institution like that over such a long period of time would be able, as a human phenomenon, to be able to sustain without leakage that measure of a lie is, to my mind, absurd. So that's where my kind of reason pops in and goes, that's so unlikely. And then you look at, okay, so who are the people I'm listening to? Now let me really read them. How do they read psychologically? How do they feel to me? And in my experience, most of the people, not all, but most of the people who are very vociferously putting forward, let's say, the flat earth meme that I've seen on YouTube or in talks or meeting people, it doesn't really jive with me. There's something off. There's something psychologically a little bit, well, you got some issues with authority, man. Because we all have issues with authority. And I have major issues with authority. My whole life has been about resisting authority in a lot of ways. In some ways in a very neurotic or psychologically unsophisticated way. And so I'm very, very, sympathetic to anti-authoritarian positions, including very radical ones to a certain degree. But that's the part where, again, I think a kind of self-reflection and a kind of desire to not be trapped in a reality tunnel is really key. Where does that desire come from? I don't know. Does everybody have it? No. Can everybody get there? Probably not. So in some ways, we just start talking, we're kind of maintaining a space that invites people into a different path, a different way of dealing with possibilities, even crazy possibilities like lizard, aliens. And for me, a lot of the conspiracy stuff, flat earth is complicated, but a lot of the other ones, they're great myths. They're folklore that try to organize something about power and control and surveillance and technology that's very real, very real.
And they're incredibly seductive, I've noticed, because the internal, I think the word I'm looking for is circular reasoning. The internal mechanisms, if you catch them, they're so well contained to just keep you there forever. There's an answer to almost any question inside of some of these theories.
That's very, very well put, and there's a couple of things to say about that. One is I've had the opportunity, I don't know whether it's a blessing or a curse, but one of my friends became very paranoid, clinically paranoid, changed his life paranoid. And talking with him, believing that this kind of reasoning that we're doing right now, this kind of conversation, which in a lot of ways is what I'm talking about, is what we're talking about here is not something that I just carry around with me. It's something you and I do together, and in doing so, help each other move forward in this complex space. And I was really doing that with my full heart open and my articulate skills with language and reasoning and everything. And it was a locked house. There was no way into that house. And people I knew who work with mental illness, or they're like, it's very hard to break out of these. Now that's a case of clinical paranoia, and I don't want to say that people who are believing conspiracy theories are clinically paranoid. But I'm saying that because it really shows that there is a way that reasons, thought experiments with answers can create a prison. And this is in some ways our neurosis, our pain is a story, like depression is a story about why I'm broken, I'll never be whole, there's no point. And it's an example of circular reasoning. And I think just in general, we should pop out of circular reasoning, return to the not knowing, deal with what it meant to really engage some reality. Maybe we love a guru, we fall in love with a guru. There we are, we follow the guru, we do devotional practices, and then we find out later he's stooping the young girls and it's a mess, and then we have to deal with it. That's not a bad thing, because you can learn sometimes a great deal, and sometimes you don't come out, and sometimes you do, but a lot of times people kind of bounce back, and that's okay to sort of go with an attraction. But if you don't have that commitment to self-inquiry, and you don't have relations with people who are skeptical in some ways, then I think it's very easy to become deluded. Or delusion is sort of a hard word. Let's say fall into a reality tunnel where suddenly it kind of explains everything for you. And it's very satisfying. It's very comforting, even if it's scary.
Thinking maybe not delusion, but so ideologically insular that nothing can penetrate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like if you're at a place where nothing can penetrate, you're just stuck. Yeah. Like that's what we just keep opening out into the mystery, opening out into connection, opening out into inquiry, into engaging each other, to making artifacts. It's a process of constantly opening out, because mostly you're opening out of your own fear and lockdown and ideas about who you are. And you can get lost doing that too. You can spin off and just not know, and sometimes people become saints that way, and sometimes they just can't do anything. It's all a risk. We're not in a situation of guarantees. But I think it's really important for those of us who are in the festival scene, who are interested in esotericism and the occult and conspiracy theory and psychedelics and shamanism and indigenous worldviews, all those things, to accept, work with, embrace, resonate, even fall in love with, and become even a bit obsessed with, but to sort of develop the practice of coming back to conversation, questioning, thinking, inquiry, research. You think you know anything about it? Ayahuasca shamanism, there's like tons of great literature. It's not all right. Anthropology is a problematic thing, but if you think you're a shaman, get to your books, man, because there's a lot of stuff you can learn just from reading, let alone going and actually, trying to connect with somebody and realize that it's a mixed up, messed up, multidimensional. They're all, everybody's modern now. It's not like you go back and they're holding on to something that went back for millions. Everybody's part of this global transformation. So everything's a mixture. Everything's kind of a mess. And so if you're called to something, go into it really deep and look at the details and the differences and the different positions and the different ways that there are to think about it. And then you find yourself once again, even though you're pursuing something very intensely, opening up into the complexity, opening up into the not knowing. I think that's actually a much clearer way to go into some of these alternative worldviews, whether it's magical thinking, occult practice, shamanism, meditation, yoga. All of these things can be trances as well as forms of inquiry.
Very cool. This kind of goes into your sort of charge to people during your lecture, which was to be a skeptical animist, I believe was the term you're looking for.
Yeah.
And I'm getting this sense of go in there, get excited, get curious, listen, learn, be challenged by what you think you already know. One of my teachers says learning is a process of losing something. To get knowledge is to just get, and eventually you have a big pile of what for what. But when you're really learning, you have to let go of certainty to get there. And at the same time, you're also saying, but as you're letting go of certainty, keep that little something there that says, whoa, hold on a second. Are you sure? And why are you sure? Is this a good...
and I think it's even the word are you sure can be a little much. You're having your experience, that you're going through it, but there's always a morning after. And in the morning after, then you reflect on it. It's don't tell your vision for 24 hours. Right. Don't, some of it is just as simple as that. Or if you fall down an internet reality hole and you start, going to different websites and they're supporting each other's, so that's one of the mechanisms of how our media condition undermines consensus reality, is things refer to other things and it looks like it's a larger network of multiple sources, but actually if you look at them, they're just kind of circulating the same ideas.
Journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting too, because then even I'm a pretty strong believer in herbal medicine and nutritional medicine and stuff, but it's so interesting when you go to a website and they make these broad claims and they've got 20-something sources and they're all Mind, Body, Green, healthnutrition.com, and eventually you get to somewhere and it's they're actually selling the product. Yeah. And it isn't in this circular world, and often encouraged by the very same digital platforms we're using to get information. I know during your talk you mentioned, and this is something I know but the listeners of my show might not know, is that Google is not an objective Google. It's a fine-tailored Google to exactly what you're looking at. Same with Facebook, targeted advertising, all these things. Everything is sort of zoomed into specialized to what you're interested in. And YouTube, it's like every video you click on, the next recommended video in the panel, one of them is going to be a more extreme version of what you just watched. And it's very easy to get lost there.
Yes, that's a very good point. I'm glad you're articulating those two very important facts. And knowing that, in a way, that this is a great way of kind of tying some things together. If you just think about this, so you're a media consumer, you're using the internet to get information about the world, about different things, what's happening, and then you become aware of this fact that Google is not objective. It's returning to you, who you are as a digital avatar, as a trace, as a profile that is developed over time with greater and greater sophistication. You know, there's some claims about how far they can know you based on your previous things. I have some doubts about that. It's a good place to be skeptical because it's in their interests, which is actually another really good question. I'll just say that one thing is to always go, whose interest is this in? Who's banking on this? Yeah. So, you know, even the cool shaman's running a shtick. He's got a thing going. He might be cool, or she might be cool. But there's also a shtick going on, and we all have our own shticks, and it's not a bad thing. But if you are always kind of asking, well, where's this? Who's benefiting from this? Where's this going? It's often a way to get behind the surface a little bit. But if we stay with this idea of where I'm a media person, and I know that the things that the machine is feeding me is a trace of my own experience and of my own buildup, not an objective recommendation, then in a way we have to start questioning ourselves. We have to start wondering, why am I in this tunnel? And sometimes it's great stuff. The recommendations are just what I wanted. Well, that makes sense because they're working all right. You know, they're good algorithms in some ways.
Yeah, I do like barefoot shoes. How interesting.
Yeah. But in the larger view, we can see the problem with that. If you think about it, it's very clear how that puts us into our own kind of circular bubble or our own way of reinforcing our ideas about the world. And what I'm saying is that problem exists in the internet, but it also kind of exists in the larger view of what's going on in reality. Who do I believe? Who do I trust? So becoming more sophisticated in how you deal with your news sources, your information feeds, is a place to train for a larger way of navigating the world, of worldviews and arguments about what's happening.
Right, which is the direction the world is currently going, and so it's really necessary. And I'm appreciating your call to action towards this sort of informational navigation literacy, to be able to navigate not just the information on the internet, but the information of like the chaotic world that we live in. As you know, one person you're talking to is a physicalist, and the next person you're talking to is 100% sure that the elves are whispering to them about the secrets of the universe, and both of which seem to be fairly reasonable, and both of which are 100% confident to some degree that they're there, and they're both your friends, and you're here at a festival and you're all chatting. It's like to have that sort of that call.
Yeah, and I think it's a part of that when I think about that kind of conversation is that there's a sweet spot where you're open to somebody else's worldview, their shtick, their thing, their vision, and you really listen to it. You really take it on, but you always take it on kind of lightly, kind of hold it like a ball in your hand, sort of like, oh yeah, like how does that work? And you just sort of develop that style so that you can be comfortable around a wide range of views, but they don't necessarily, they maybe nudge you, maybe knock you over a little bit, and like you got to see how you respond. But there's less of immediate attraction or immediate repulsion.
Well, that's cool. That's like it's like saying questing to understand rather than seeking to have certainty confirmed.
Very
because if I'm certain about something and you're saying something I don't agree with, I'm like very repulsed by you. And if you're saying something and I could be very attracted to you. And that can be very dangerous, right? The issue of we were kind of talking about, we can get sucked into these little loops, but I could also miss on something so beautiful if I you say one word that I don't like, and all of a sudden my certainty is
Yeah.
like, fuck this guy,
Yeah.
essentially. But then there's something really valuable of like, well, I don't agree and I'm kind of uncomfortable and I really want to understand where that's coming from.
Oh, I know. There's so much need for that kind of conversation. It's very hard to have now, and it's extremely hard to have in the internet, in social media. And in fact, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Like once you're everything's already set up. So if you get involved in an argument on Twitter, it's everything's set up. There's no way out. You're just going to repeat. There's no coming to connection, because I think a lot of times there has to be a personal connection, not necessarily face to face, but some specific connection so that you can ask a difficult question like, about gender or about race or about class or about positionality or privilege or all these things that are now part of the left. Because while we've been talking about conspiracy theory and also we talked earlier about fascism, there's a lot of very sick things that are happening on the left, certainly in terms of just all these, the way that language is becoming politicized, identities so politicized that it becomes
Every
difficult.
behavior is politicized.
Yeah.
Like we're making the fact that I'm, sitting in a certain way is a political action that I'm representing for the world.
Right, and we're both white guys who are sitting here talking and and that there's a problem with that. And yes, there is, but the solution to that problem, or even just the investigation of that problem, because some of these problems are ancient and irresolvable. No one's ever going to heal the reality of slavery in America from American soul. We just have to deal with it in different ways. But to get there, what's happening with the confirmation of identity inside identity politics is very similar to this belief thing that we've been talking about. I know I have a certain identity. There's a boundary around that identity on the inside of who I identify with, and these are our values, and this is our politics. And then I go out in the world, and anything that triggers that from the outside, no matter how complex, no matter where it's coming from, it gets this kind of response. Boom, boom, boom. Now, there's a lot of people who are way more sophisticated than that who are dealing with precisely these issues, which are absolutely necessary for us to deal with. But especially as it manifests in social media, there's some very toxic patterns that I don't really know how we break. I don't think it can break inside that space. I think it requires other kinds of places. And my hope always is that there's people who are kind of more like me in other places that want to actually talk through these things and are willing to be uncomfortable and to have conflict and to have to be able to say, okay, that one we're not going to resolve. But it's very difficult to do because the tendency is to hold down with your position, and so
find a person to blame, find a war to fight, an enemy to crucify. That might be a little strong language, but sometimes it looks like that.
Sometimes, people do get crucified. In the sense of social shaming. Social shaming is now a fact of online reality that's incredibly significant. It's a kind of a new form of violence where you're able to, partly through chance and partly through engineering, destroy someone's profile, to shame someone publicly at such a degree that their life circumstances, their psychology, their job, everything gets threatened without anything like a court of law or anything like a adjudicating body. And while obviously the courts of law are not to be trusted, adjudicating bodies are not to be trusted, we can kind of trust them sometimes.
Right.
But the other thing is someone's rumor of what somebody else said about this person being a this, and so now I'm on the bandwagon when they show up and they say, whoa, like...
And this all goes back into sort of, what you're calling for is like a, kind of like maybe not calm down, but like be prepared and condition yourself to be present to the complex nuances, the complexity of factors that go into any given thing, and to be with that in a way. And I might not be properly characterizing what you're saying.
No, you're very much, you're right on target. And again, this kind of brings us back to psychedelics, is that if we think about what do we bring back from psychedelics, a lot of people kind of go like they're like vision hunters. It's like, I'm going to have like the vision or the peak or the blast off or the like cosmic encounter, or maybe the encounter with the spirit or the spirit of the medicine. Yeah, great. great. But there's something else that's going on, which is just fucking confused because there's so much going on and there's so many dimensions and like, oh my God, and like I'm navigating my own personality and I'm navigating these other domains and I don't know what's going on, and how do I be in this space? How do I be in a space of complexity? You know, confusion is an aspect of it, but there's also a kind of chaotic complexity of what's happening that we can learn from and that we can learn to be okay with. And just to accept that this is part of what reality is like, is not knowing, is being open, is being threatened to some degree. There's a profound vulnerability there, but also a certain kind of trust that develops that's much finer than I believe the trust we have in some external demagogue or some position that we're holding on to. And I know that there's only matter and consciousness is just an expression of neurons and we're just, you know, Darwinian robots driven by our own algorithms, so why not just reprogram ourselves or whatever. You're like, whoa, that's pretty fucking crazy. But, you know, I've been in psychedelic places where that makes a lot of sense, actually. I can kind of see something like that going on. So I'm like, oh, okay, interesting, all right, okay. But I'm neither too threatened or too seduced by these perspectives. And I think that's a good way to navigate psychedelic space, and I think it's a good way to navigate the world. It doesn't solve all problems. Maybe we all need to come together with some crazy idea, or we're just going to be destroyed by the right wing, or who, you know, I don't know.
Right, or just destroyed by each other, destroying each other.
You know.
Yeah.
And so it's no solutionism, and I guess that's what I'm not really for solutionism. I remember I took a class from Cornell West in college. You know, wonderful, crazy, brilliant African-American, you know, intellectual, race activist, philosopher, fascinating guy. And he has a Christian background, you know, came out of the black church, but it was an intellectual and political leftist. And he talked about, you know, this metaphor that for me worked with everything, was just we're on a boat together. The boat is leaking. We're bailing the boat.
Yeah, that's actually probably one of my favorite lines from an Immortal Technique song, who's a Latino-American like gangster rap, like very politicized rapper. It's something like, we're all in the same boat and it's sinking, and it doesn't make sense that we're fighting over who gets what seat when the elite are cruising in a fucking luxury liner watching us drown.
Yeah.
And I mean, just let that sink in.
No, it's true. I mean, we haven't talked about the elite and the fact that we are in a situation, and that's partly where the conspiracy theories make sense, because they're allegories of organizations of power which have varying degrees, probably, of truth in a kind of literal historical sense, which I still believe in. I still believe in talking about history and things that we can kind of sociologically analyze as best we can. And within that there is an elite, and there is you know, the elite are worried about the end of the world. They're trying to think about how to, you know, manage the end of the world, how you know, in all sorts of ways, and how to play the game, how to take advantage of the chaos in all sorts of ways. And everybody's playing their hand. Everybody's playing their hand. Now is the time to play. We're not holding. I mean, there may be some things being held back, games that can be played at later phases of degradation. Sure. But in terms of basically, like, now is the time to kind of like shape social reality in a way that benefits us. I think we're just, you know, we're in full force, and, you know, we may go down, you know, whatever, and I don't know what to do. You know, I don't have any answers. I don't have any political solutions that are really obvious, but I feel like what I'm talking about has to be developed in order for us to be able to engage those possibilities in a way that's both awake and open to possibility.
Excellent, Erik, thank you. Why don't you let the listeners know where they can find out more about your work, about your podcast, about your book?
Sure. Yeah, my podcast is called Expanding Mind. I've been doing it for 8 years. It's almost weekly, hour-long conversation about all sorts of things that kind of around this space. And my website is called Techgnosis, and that's spelled Techgnosis, and I have my podcast there and tons of writing. I've been writing for decades. So there's a huge archive of stuff about these kinds of topics. And I have a couple books, and another book coming out next year called High Weirdness. It's about psychedelics in the 70s. So those are places to find me.
Excellent. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, man, thanks. Right on.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Erik Davis. He is an interesting and thoughtful guy, and I was really happy to sit down with him. If you head to the show notes to this episode, which are contained at jameswjesso.com, episode 88, you'll be able to find links to a variety of Erik Davis's stuff, including his main website, Technosis, his podcast, Expanding Mind, his book, Technosis, as well as the actual lecture that he gave at Ozora, which is now available up on YouTube. Links to all of that are going to be contained in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, episode 88. If you appreciated this podcast and are continuing to appreciate this podcast, sharing it on social media or sharing it with a friend directly is a great way to support the show. Alternatively, if you would like to do so financially, you can do so by, sometimes the way that I say things feels awkward, and I'm not going to edit this out. I'm just going to keep going. You can support the show financially by heading to jameswjesso.com/support, where you will see a bunch of options, including Patreon, PayPal donations, crypto donations, a online shop that I just put out where you can buy the brand new Adventures Through the Mind t-shirts, the new lecture I just put out on ritualistic suffering with psychedelics, and a variety of different other interesting things like art and blotter art, which is still available. Please, go grab some of that. And yeah, that's it. So thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of this episode, and I will see you for the next one. This has been Adventures Through the Mind with James W. Jesso. Take care.